the scribe who wrote the Old Testament. Ezra chapter 7, 1 to chapter 10, stopping at verse 44. From the court of the great king at Shushan, we turn once more to the Hebrew Jews at Jerusalem and in Judea. For a long time after the first company came to the land under Zerubbabel, very few Hebrew Jews from other countries joined them. The Hebrews in Judea were poor and discouraged. Many of them had borrowed money which they could not pay, and had been sold as slaves to richer Hebrew Jews. Around them on every side were their enemies, the idol-worshipping people in the land and the Samaritans on the north. These enemies robbed them of their crops in the field, and they also constantly sent evil and false reports of them to the Persian governors. Many of the men of Israel had married women of the land, not of the Israelite race, and their children were growing up half heathen and half Hebrew Jewish, unable to talk in the language of their fathers and knowing nothing of the true God. 90 years after the Hebrew Jews had come back to the land, Jerusalem was a small town with many of its old houses still in ruins, and no wall around it. In those times, no city could be safe from its enemies without a wall, so that Jerusalem lay helpless against bands of robbers who came up from the desert and carried away nearly all that the people could earn. Just at the time when the land was in the deepest need, Yahuwah raised up 2 men to help his people. These 2 men were Ezra and Nehemiah. Through Ezra, the people of Judah were led back to their God, to worship him, to serve him, and especially to love Yahuwah's book as they never had loved it before. And about the same time, Nehemiah gave new hope and courage and strength to the people by helping them to build a wall around Jerusalem. The work of these 2 men brought to Judea peace and plenty, and led many Jews from other lands to their own country. Ezra was a priest living in the city of Babylon, though he had sprung from the family of Aaron, the first priest. He was also a prophet through whom Yahuwah spoke to his people. But above all, Ezra was a lover of Yahuwah's book in a time when the book of Yahuwah was almost forgotten. Nearly all the books of what we call the Old Testament had been written for a long time. But in those days there were no printed books. Each copy was written separately with a pen, and as the labor was great, there were very few copies of the different books of the Bible. And these copies were in different places. One book of the Bible was in one place, another book was in another place. Very few people in those times before Ezra had owned or had even seen the whole of the Old Testament in one book or set of books. Ezra began to seek everywhere among the Hebrew Jews for copies of these different books. Whenever he found one, he wrote it out and kept the copy, and also led other men to copy the books as they found them. At last, Ezra had copies written of all the books in the Old Testament except the very latest books. They were written very nearly as we have them now, except that his copies were all in Hebrew, the language spoken by the men who wrote most of the Old Testament. Ezra put all these different books together, making one book out of many books. This great book was written on parchment or sheepskin, in long rows, as in old time old books were written. When the book was finished, it was called the Book of the Law, because it contained Yahuwah's law for his people, as given through Moses and Samuel and David and Isaiah and all the other prophets. When Ezra had finished writing this book of the law, he went on a long journey from Babylon to Judea, taking with him the rolls of the book. With Ezra went a company of men whom he had taught to love the law, to write copies of it, to read it, and to teach it to others. These men, who gave their lives to studying and copying and teaching the law, were called scribes, a word which means writers. Ezra was the first and the greatest of these scribes, but from this time there were many scribes among the Hebrew Jews, both in Judea and in all other lands. For wherever the Hebrew Jews lived, they began to read the Bible, the Old Testament, and to love it. The time came soon after Ezra's day, when in every place where the Hebrew Jews met to worship, at least one copy of all the books in the Old Testament was kept, so that there was no more danger that the Old Testament or any part of it would be lost. You remember that there was only one temple for all the Hebrew Jews in the world, and only one altar. Upon this one altar, and there alone, was offered the sacrifice every day. But the Hebrew Jews in distant places needed to meet together for worship, and there grew up among the Hebrew Jews everywhere what was called the synagogue, a word that means coming together. At first, they met in a room, but afterward they built houses for the synagogues, much like our temples and churches. In fact, the synagogue was the congregation of the Hebrew Jews in every city or town where Hebrew Jews were found. Some of these synagogues or temples were large and beautiful, and in them the people met every week to worship Yahuwah, to sing the psalms, to hear the law and the prophets read, and to talk together about what they had heard. It was something like a prayer meeting, for any Hebrew Jew who wished to speak in the meeting could do so. The men sat on mats laid on the floor. The rulers of the synagogue were on seats raised up above the rest. The women were in a gallery on one side, covered with a lattice work so that they could see and hear, but could not be seen. And on the end of the room nearest to Jerusalem, there was a large box or chest called the Ark, within which were kept the copies of the books of the Old Testament. Thus, through the synagogue temple, all the Hebrew Jews in the world listened to the reading of the Old Testament, until very many of them knew every word of it by heart. All this came to pass from Ezra's work in copying and teaching the word of Yahuwah. And Ezra wrought another work almost as great as that of giving the Old Testament to the world. He taught the Hebrew Jewish people, first in Israel and then in other lands, that they were the people of Yahuwah, and that they must live apart from other nations. If they had gone on marrying women of other races who worshipped other gods, after a time there would have been no Hebrew Jews and no worshippers of Yahuwah. Ezra made some of them give up their wives of other nations, and he taught the Hebrew Jews to be a people by themselves, keeping away from those who worshipped idols, even though they lived among them. Thus Ezra led the Hebrew Jews to look upon themselves as a holy people, given up to the service of Yahuwah. He taught them to live apart from other nations with their own customs and ways of living, and very exact in obeying the law of Yahuwah in the books given by Moses, even in some things that would seem small and not important. They were to be trained age after age in the service and worship of Yahuwah. It was Yahuwah's will that the Hebrew Jews should be separate from other peoples and very strict in keeping their law, until the time should come for them to go out and preach the good news to all the world. But that was long after Ezra's day. The Hebrew Jews even now, in our time, continue to keep many of the rules that were given to their fathers long ago by Ezra. So next to Moses, Ezra had greater power over the Hebrew Jews than any other prophet or teacher. All over the world, the Hebrew Jews look upon Ezra as the greatest man in their history except Moses. They called him the second founder of Israel.